What does a beautiful future look like to you?
You can flip a negative mood on its head.
This was a talk that was all over the place, but then New York, you are all over the place.
There are experiences that you just don't get anywhere else.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight for the final conversation in MacDowell's partnership with the 92nd Street Y. This series is meant to mimic the unscripted, interdisciplinary conversations that happen every day at MacDowell in the residency program on contemporary topics. For those of you who are unfamiliar, composer Edward MacDowell and his wife, the pianist Marian MacDowell, founded MacDowell in 1907 to nurture the arts by offering creative individuals of the highest talent an inspiring environment to produce enduring works of the imagination. Each year, MacDowell welcomes more than 300 architects, composers, filmmakers, interdisciplinary artists, theater artists, visual artists, and writers from across the United States and around the globe for 2 weeks to 2 months on our 450-acre grounds in Peterborough, New Hampshire. And I am speaking to you from Peterborough, New Hampshire, from the Savage Library in the James Baldwin Library at MacDowell, where I am actually in residence right now. Recipients at MacDowell have included James Baldwin, who was one of the earliest non-white fellows in the mid-50s, Benny Andrews, Michael Chabon, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Louise Erdrich, Gia Tolentino, Kathy Park Hong, Dee Reese, Colson Whitehead, among so many others. Tonight is one of the many ways we seek to foster community, and we hope that you will visit our website, MacDowell, for more information. I'd like to introduce you to my fellow conversationalists, Mary Schmidt Campbell, who was the director in the formative years of this Studio Museum in Harlem, currently president of Spelman College. Lonnie Bunch, who is the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, but who was the founding director and the prime mover of the project of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And Marc Payot, who is the president of the International Gallery Hauser Wirth. And Hauser Wirth has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is that right, Mark? 7 different galleries around the world and a publishing arm. So the 3 of them have had extensive experience in going from somebody's good idea in the arts to actually making large institutions. And what I'd like for us to talk about this evening is what happens in that process between inspiration about wanting to nurture arts and culture and raising the money that it takes to get that art out into the world. So the question this evening is, how does big money influence how we can see art and culture? And actually, I want to start with Mary, because you went from a very, very tiny institution and you made it into something kind of a mini MoMA, would you say?
Well, we were a loft over a liquor store and a Kentucky Fried Chicken in our early days, 10,000 square feet.
Yeah.
And yes, we moved into our own building. We built a permanent collection. We built a body of literature around that art, and we won accreditation. And so it's a great question now. How do you go from really that little loft with a handful of people, many of them from the Harlem community? No one on my board had wealth to speak of. I certainly didn't have. I was coming right out of graduate school almost. How do you build the kind of support that's going to build the kind of resources that are going to get you from that loft into a permanent museum?
Mary, wait. Let me stop you for a second.
Sure.
When you say from here to there, what could the there do that the here couldn't?
The here was the loft.
Yeah.
Right. And we could do great exhibitions. We could assemble contemporary artists. They would work with us literally to mount these extraordinary exhibitions. And we could do these little publications. They were stapled at the spine and we get them out, and those were our publications. The there, however, gave us the capacity to begin to preserve those works. And the importance of that was really made really clear to me when I did the Harlem Renaissance show in about the late 1980s.
And for those who don't know, the Harlem Renaissance show was?
It was a survey of really the flowering of the visual arts in particular in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s, right up to World War II. When we started looking for some of the masterpieces of the Harlem Renaissance, and we discovered them in collections at the Schomburg, at the collections of historically Black colleges and universities, one of the things we found is that they were in fragile condition. They needed preservation. And it struck us that, if we don't do that conservation work, these are the material evidence of our heritage and our history is going to disappear. And doing that conservation work takes money. And so we were able to engage the federal government, in this case, NEH and NEA, in preserving that work. But it became very, very clear that somebody has to make investments in the preservation, in creating the literature. And it was the first exhibition where we had a major publisher publish this catalog instead of that little stapled handouts that we had. We had Abrams actually publish the catalog. Beautiful color reproductions, essays by Deborah Willis and David Levering Lewis and other notables. And all of a sudden you have a permanent record. And so it became very, very clear to us that it was imperative to begin to build those kinds of financial resources that were necessary to preserve and interpret our culture.
Okay. Well, when you talk about preserving and interpreting, that really is the museum. And that really is Lonnie Bunch.
Yes.
Lonnie?
Well, in some ways, I really followed the work of what Mary has done. And for me, it really was a question of how do you create an institution that preserves, makes visible research, collections around African American history and culture. And as you know, we started with a staff of 2. We had no collections. We had no site where the museum would be. We had $37 that my oldest daughter gave us to get me started. But what we had was a dream. The dream was that the story of the African American community is a story that is broader than that community. It's the fundamental story of shaping the American experience. So we had this sense that we could create an institution that on the one hand would be true to the culture, would be shaped by the best scholarship, would allow you to dig deeply into African American culture. But then the other side was to say this was the quintessential American story.
Sure.
That this is a story that shapes us all, and that everybody needed to really understand themselves or they couldn't understand America.
Yeah.
And then the challenge really was the realization that to do all this was going to cost at least $700 million. Wow. And the federal government said they would give half, but there was no guarantee. There was a promise, but there wasn't a system that said, here's how you get this money. And
Ooh.
then I realized that money was going to shape everything we had to do. It was going to
Uh-oh.
shape the ability to build an institution, to build collections, to publish, to bring the best scholars in. And so, in essence, what we had to do was from the very beginning, as important as it was to think about the what of the museum, we spent a lot of time thinking about the how. How do you get the resources? What are the ways that you help, sometimes shame the federal government? What are the ways that you can get corporate America to understand that this is not a story to run away from, but a story to embrace? And then how do you make sure that you can get grassroots support? Because the bottom line was that, what to me was the foundation of everything. To get people to say, I'm going to give you $25, $50 to join as a member. Because what that did is it had a ripple effect. Not only did it give us beginning of money to do the work, but it also allowed me to track every donor we had, so that therefore when I went to Congress, I can say, Congresswoman, in your district, we had X number of members. Pay attention to us. So ultimately, it was really about recognizing that this was too important a story to be underfunded. And so we really had on parallel tracks the what and the how.
Yeah. So how would not having big money, and when I say big money, I mean both your strategy of lots of people giving perhaps modest amounts in addition to large institutions getting large amounts, to having millions. What difference did that make on how we see what became your museum?
Well, it really allowed us to do several things. As you know better than I felt it was really important that this is a museum of history and culture,
Mhm.
and that the African American expression, whether it musical or artistic, needed to be a key part of that. And
Yeah.
so, as you could imagine, building a collection of African American art was very costly. And it really forced us to think of a variety of strategies. Some to actually get some corporations to give us money just for acquisitions,
Mhm.
others to go to donors who had collections and say, look, most of you are not ready to give your collections to a museum. You know, you've had it for one generation.
Right.
But could you give us 4 pieces? Could you give us a motley? Could you give us, pieces that would really be transformative? And that worked. So in a way, that was the other way of sort of recognizing we needed the money. But if we didn't have the money, how are there other ways we could get people to support us in giving us the fine arts? So
Yeah.
my concern was that you either go big or you go home. And I did not want to create something that would be an embarrassment for our community.
Yeah. We'll come back to the question of going big or going home. Marc, you go big. Hauser Wirth is one of the, if not the premier international galleries worldwide. And you also publish. How does big money influence what you can publish, say? Not just what you can show and what you can sell. Because lone among us here talking, you run a for-profit, which makes, I suppose, a big difference. Maybe you should answer that first. Does running a for-profit make a big difference in how you let us see art?
Well, maybe I can tell you a little bit how we started and how this all came about, and how it is now a company with 14 locations around the world. The gallery is close to 30 years old, and we started in Switzerland. And when you start in Switzerland, a contemporary gallery, no artist is really interested of an artist of international status to show in Switzerland. So we needed to create a structure which would make it interesting for artists to show with us, and also select artists who needed it. So, the 30 years ago, the art world is mainly dominated by white male painters.
Yeah.
Conservative, male, and white. So from the beginning, we focused on women and artists of color. And, you know, it's definitely with, you know, the understanding that these were very important artists, but also seeing us from an entrepreneurial point of view, an opportunity to make a difference where there was a possibility to grow. And so, you know, Louise Bourgeois, one example, was very, very early on part of the program. We organized first David Hammond's show in 2003. So it was really always part of us to see the art world in a very holistic way. And there, of course, publication is one tool to promote, to speak, to have different voices express what's important about an artist. Today, it's really just one of many tools. That the online realities, you know, are, I would say, equally important, especially in terms of access. If you have a very active and interesting online presence, then that is free for whoever wants to access that information, and is key in promoting the artist, where you don't have the barrier of having to buy the book or travel to a place, let's say New York, and maybe enter a gallery, which is still, you know, difficult for many. But the online access is much, you know, it's much more democratic and in that sense accessible. So yes, of course, the money plays a role in order to be able to do all of this, but it is really from an entrepreneurial point of view that, you know, that is one tool among many, and with the goal to show, promote, and also sell the work.
What kind of tensions and conflicts occur when you operate internationally and you want to show artists of color and women artists? Do you ever encounter tensions there between doing your business and letting us see the art?
Well, I think regardless of your decisions, you will always have people disagreeing with what you do. And in that sense, that is, you know, major tension. Or you would have clients say, oh, when is this Afro-American bubble over, right? And that obviously in itself is very, very racist. And it's not only that it's here to stay, it is, you know, it is part of our history and part of a very important part. And if you know, if someone says, oh, there are 5 major galleries in New York right now showing Afro-American artists, this is so incredible. And I say, well, only 5, right? So it's really, it's all a question. If you want, there's always tension, but there would also be tension if we show only white artists, right? Then you would have other people not agreeing with what we do. So what's essential is that we believe in what we do, that we think that we really focus on the artist, on the best quality there is of, you know, in a holistic view of our generations, and then defend that.
How do you defend that?
By showing it, organizing museum shows for these artists, by participating in art fairs and showing that work, focusing on the context, that you put younger artists in more historical contexts, and with that it gives them an additional value in selling the work in important museum collections. That is important. So we, you know, the better we do our job, the better these artists are served.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Mary and Lonnie, you both nodded and grinned ruefully when Marc quoted some collectors saying, when is this bubble going to burst? And you're both old enough to have lived through iterations of that question. Mary, when did you first hear that?
So now I came to the Studio Museum in 1977. That was over 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was asked, so this is a little fad, this little loft is going to close, and then you'll become part of the Museum of Modern Art.
Right.
And establishing insisting that there was a space and a place for the museum in the first place was critical. But I was struck as I listened to both Marc and Lonnie that the Studio Museum also occupied another type of space, and that was for the working artists, because we had an artist and they still do have an artist in residency program. So David Hammonds was an artist in residence 40 years ago at the Studio Museum, as were Daoud Bey and Kerry James Marshall and Alison Sarr and countless other numbers of artists, many of whom are now MacArthur Genius Awardees,
yes.
right?
Yes.
As were many of the curators like Kelly Jones and Deborah Willis, who also who did exhibitions at the museum, who also have risen to great acclaim. So the function of these spaces for like Hauser and Wirth and Studio Museum as incubators is invaluable, absolutely invaluable, because the moment, particularly 40 years ago, the moment these artists stepped out of these spaces, they heard exactly what Marc was saying. Oh, when is this fad going to be over? So within the cocoon of our space, they could develop, grow, take risks, try things out, and really cultivate the growth of their art.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I tried to take it from the other end.
Right.
Hearing that my whole career, I said, it's so important to build a museum on the mall. It's so important for the symbol. And it's so important to have a building that had a little dark color to it. When I was trying to build a museum, all the people that are guardians of the mall said, well, we might like your design if you could make sure it was white marble. And I said, so you stand in front of the New York Times and tell them you're making me do the African American Museum in a white marble building? And so for me, it was also about, let me put that argument to rest. Let me put a symbol, a stake on the mall that said, as long as there's an America, you're going to have to grapple with these questions. This is no longer something that may be a fad, may not be important. Rather, this is now something that you're going to have to face every day as long as there's an America. And so I really built on the work of Mary and so many others to say, how do I put a sort of, period to all the struggles that they carried on? And that's why it was so important to have that building on the National Mall.
Yeah. And so you could tell people who saw themselves coming that it was always going to be there.
Absolutely. To me, it was so important to say, there's a hint of permanence, right? When you look at that mall, the Jefferson, even, the Lincoln, and when they put King up, it was like, we've got somebody black there forever.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I wanted was to say that so much about culture really is something that you need to engage in a museum. That a monument's great, but a monument doesn't give you living artists. It doesn't give you the contextualization that you need. It doesn't make you grapple with ambiguity, which is what is so needed in a country that often looks for simple answers to complex questions. So for me, this was really an opportunity to say, this will now change the discourse. Yes, it'll change the color of the mall, but it'll change the discourse. And that was really part of the goal.
And it's so great because it is the essence of what cultural art can be, the transformative power, right, of that. And it is essential that it is on the mall and not somewhere hidden, I've seen that, in a different way with one of our Afro-American artists, Amy Sherald, who had a show with us in the gallery, and to see these hundreds and hundreds of Afro-American youth, coming to the gallery, seeing her paintings there and what it does in their lives, and what it's so transformative, and that it is in a powerful gallery is essential. and not for the commercial value. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about what it transforms in these people's lives, to see there is a way to make it, right? And we are valued. And this is, I think, is really is absolutely essential that it is, in your case, on the mall.
You mentioned Amy Sherald, and we haven't talked about Spelman College, but Amy trained at the Atlanta University Center. That's where she went to school. She was at Clark Atlanta University. She's a Clark Atlanta University graduate, but took most of her courses at Spelman, and would talk about how, you know, they would stay in the restroom after hours, and so they could sneak out and stay in the studio all night long. But it speaks also to other institutions outside of, museums and galleries, but educational institutions, and specifically historically Black colleges and universities that trained African-American artists at a time when there were very few places for them to get professional training. And many of the artists then in turn came back to teach. Hale Woodruff here at the AUC, or Aaron Douglas at Fisk, and others at Howard and Hampton and other places. So it's extraordinary to really understand the very complex network that's involved of different communities that go into supporting all of this work.
So you have a museum at Spelman, don't you?
Yes, we do. A very fine museum.
Yeah. Who do you show there?
Well, right now we don't have a show up because of COVID. We have not reopened the museum, but we will in about a month or two. And I'm not going to tell you what the show is because it's going to be very exciting, and we think it's going to have real resonance.
Yeah. Are there things that you would do, you as a college president, a Spelman College president, as someone with a distinguished background in art history and art criticism, would there be something you would do if somebody came to you with a big pot of money and said, President Mary Schmidt Campbell, here's a big pot of money. I want you to spend it on the arts at Spelman.
So in fact, Nell, exactly that thing happened.
Whoa.
It did. It came from the Alice Walton Foundation.
Yeah.
And we used those funds to set up something called the Atlanta University Center Collective for the study of art history and curatorial studies. Because not only does Spelman have a museum, Clark Atlanta has this wonderful gallery, which was one of the few places back in the 40s where African-American artists could exhibit on a regular basis. And they have been building a collection since then, exquisite collection. So you looked around, and we have these wonderful archives at the Woodruff Art Center. And we looked around and said, look at the resources we have. And so we borrowed a wonderful art historian, Dr. Cheryl Finley from Cornell.
Oh, yeah.
And we charged her with setting up a training ground where the AUC, the Atlanta University Center, would be the principal center for the education of curators and art historians for this country. And we are going great guns. So, and now we've gotten a gift to renovate one of our arts facilities, and we're about to build a new facility. So we're extremely excited about what the future holds for the Atlanta University Center.
Yes. I'm so glad to hear that. One of the charges of Lonnie Bunch's former institution and his current institution, which is everything, is the history and the criticism. And that, from what I understand, I'm not a big art historian by any means, but I have read something about the frustrations of Black artists in the 20th century, particularly, of not having their work written about. I remember once going to the College Art Association to hear Faith Ringgold talk about her work. This is when I was an art student. And she said that she was complaining to her daughter and her friends that nobody was writing about her art. And she talked to her daughter, the critic, Michelle Wallace, and said, you know, can you write about me? And Michelle was writing about stuff, you know, she was not an art historian at the time, she's cultural studies. And Faith's good friend, Florence Kennedy, said, write your own damn self. And she did. And I found that really inspiring. So, Lonnie, you probably have in your collections, plural, African-American women artists of all sorts who, well, the Smithsonian artists of all sorts, at the museum, artists and historians and archivists of African-American heritage, writing about the collection and about the works. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think in many ways, I've always been struck, you know, Nell, we're of that generation where historians, you know, like John Hope and, you know, even earlier, you know, opened doors for us. And so part of what I wanted to do, both at the museum and at the Smithsonian, is to recognize, first of all, that the Smithsonian is standing on a lot of shoulders, that there's been a lot of amazing work. You know, sometimes the Smithsonian acts like it's the ship and all else is the sea. And my notion is that the Smithsonian needs to learn. And so part of what I wanted to do at the museum was to say, let us first give a kind of survey overview of African American art, because there are millions of people who would come to that building who won't get that anywhere else. Yeah. And then I said, once you do that, and now the museum is evolving, I said, I'd like the museum to focus on contemporary art. I'd like the museum to collect contemporary art, to interpret, to write about it, to make sure that we take those risks so that 50 years from now, we are ensured that the Smithsonian has an amazingly diverse but a critical collection. And so I think that that's where I push the museum. And luckily at the Smithsonian, we have the Smithsonian Art Museum, the Portrait Gallery, work at the Hirshhorn. So what I'm trying to do now is to say, all of you have a piece of this story. And I want to see how that connects within the entire institution. Because the great strength of the Smithsonian is that it gives people different portals into African-American culture. But often it forgets to do that. You can come to it through the Art at SAM, or you can come to it through the Hirshhorn or the African-American Museum. So part of the challenge is to challenge them to grapple with contemporary art, and also then to challenge them to actually talk to each other. Because one of the great strengths when I was a museum director, even when I was a curator, you know, the great thing to say was, I never dealt with another Smithsonian museum for that past year. That was a badge of pride. So I've tried to say, y'all gonna talk to each other, okay? You're a family, whether you like it or not. My hope is that will change the way we can do some of the work that I think is so important.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask all three of you a question that I didn't prepare you for. I apologize for that, but it's crossed my mind as we talk. You've all mentioned curators, and I'm not sure that all of our audience know how crucial curators are and the relationship between curators and money. So, Marc, do you have in your mind a thought about the relationship between curators and money, and what your curators would do if you had a whole lot more money and a whole lot less money?
So, you know, traditionally a gallery doesn't employ curators, right? The curators work for a museum and or are freelance, and we might hire a curator for a specific project, but it is not, you know, it's not part of the gallery's responsibility to have curators on staff. Traditionally, you know, we have one or two from the close to 300 staff members, which are, you know, helping us develop ideas for the artists in terms of institutional shows. But it's what we are more doing is when a curator is interested in one of our artists, and it is about, then money comes into play because research is needed, resources to actually have the time to write, to think, sometimes with travel expenses, and there, when it's appropriate and when it's useful, we might help financially that that research can happen. And sometimes that's not appropriate, and then it's better that we don't do anything. But it is really more in a supporting role, not in an active, direct relationship to the curator.
So who decides which artists to show when and where? Do you do that?
You mean within the gallery?
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. That's me and my co-presidents. We are three, and it's the most important decision.
Yes.
It's a little bit comparable to an agent in the music industry,
Sure.
where we have artists under contract, and that can be only for Europe or only for America or a worldwide representation. And for those artists, we manage the careers, we sell their art, we organize museum shows, we promote, we do publications. So it's a very holistic approach to that career. But yes, these decisions are the most important, and we take those.
Yeah. And that includes publishing about the art and the artists?
Yes, so the publishing arm, because the knowledge is a very specific one, is a separate department. And depending on the priorities we have within the program, we decide what comes with a book. And it is between, with the pandemic, that shifted because a lot was not possible. But the year in 2019, we did 20 books.
Wow.
And then 2020 was reduced to 7 or 8, and now we are regrouping and rethinking for 2022. But it's a very important part of what we do. We believe very much in the classical book, which then the content is taken and used on several also online platforms.
So now it's an interesting question, because 40 years ago, I couldn't name more than 3 or 4 Black curators. Right. And the curatorial role at a museum is essential, right? That's where the ideas for the exhibitions, doing the research that is required to select the individual pieces, to know where the donors are, to write the count, all of that comes from the curator. So it was a place like the Studio Museum is not only a support mechanism for the artists, it's a place where you can also incubate the museum professional. And
you'll be doing that in your new center also.
That's right. That's
absolutely
exactly right.
Lonnie, do you incubate your own curators? Do they come to you from outside?
We do. As obviously a historian whose career was shaped by being a curator, I do think they're the engine of these institutions. And they're the engines, as Mary said, for the scholarship, for the relationships they build. And what I wanted to do was to make sure that there were many, many more curators of color and curators who appreciated color than ever before. And so the work that Mary's doing is so important. And at the Smithsonian, what I've tried to do is, the Smithsonian traditionally was a place that hired curators only after they had been at the top of the profession. And I really said that's wrong, because that was a way to keep many of the young African-American curators out. So when I was building the African-American Museum, I had a conscious structure that said, I want 2/3 of everybody we hire to be on the upswing. to be junior curators who've demonstrated scholarship and appreciation, but have a lot of room to grow. And then I want a third to be the people who are at the top of their career. And I wanted that learning environment where the junior people learn from the senior, and the senior people are made better by that engagement. So I
Yes.
really tried to think very creatively about who do you hire, how do you hire, and I'm now trying to encourage the rest of the Smithsonian, especially in the art museums, to think about it that way as well, to make sure that you're getting a variety of points of view, and that you're really taking a risk, because the Smithsonian is a place that doesn't like risk. And if you're black, risk is all you got. And so for me, it really is trying to say, let me tell you that you can be sure that you're going to do great work, but if you take the risk, look at the upside. And so that's what I'm trying to do throughout the entire Smithsonian.
Yeah.
That
So
is such a great idea, Lonnie. I'm sorry, Nell, for interrupting, but I'm so excited by that idea. It makes so much sense. I wish every museum in America could follow your lead.
Well, thank you. I mean, one of the things I've learned from you and so many of our colleagues is that, for African American curators, part of this is a nimbleness that other curators didn't have to have, right? You had to have the scholar, you better be good. You better be able to write, but
yeah.
you've also got to figure out other ways to maneuver through a system that necessarily didn't want you. And so what I realized at the Smithsonian, that when I first came to the Smithsonian as a curator, God, in the 80s,
Yeah.
there were basically 3 black curators at the Museum of American History, none in the art museums. And so what I was struck by is the Smithsonian hired its first African American curator in 1980.
Wow.
Right? 1980. Now they had researchers, but they weren't curators. So I never forgot that, because I was there. I just left the Smithsonian, and I remember being told that, oh, you're going to be a good scholar, but maybe one day, 20 years from now, you'll be a curator.
Uh-huh.
I was never that patient. So I think part of it is really saying, how do I make an old institution feel new?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's the creativity of, and it's the curators, it's different collaborations, it's really taking opportunities to do work that 30 years ago the Smithsonian would have never considered to do. So let's take those risks, and then my hope is when they run me out, that I'll get a fellowship where you are now.
Yes. Yes, you'd be very welcome. Now, Marc, Hauser and Wirth is not a place that takes risks, is it?
Absolutely, we take a lot of risk. Every single new collaboration is
Sure.
is a risk, and but that's all the fun, right? This is what it is about, and to really believe truly in an artist and do everything we can that this is becoming even more successful and is seen by more people and is becoming part of art history. That is our ultimate goal. For every artist we show, we want them as part of art history.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's protecting the artist because there is a lot of speculation. Sometimes it's putting the artist in a more historical context where it needs some gravitas. Sometimes it's pushing it from a market point of view, that the artist needs that bigger gallery support. So every single case is different, but the goal is the same, is a very long-term goal of placing these artists in the canon of art history.
And when you say art history, you're speaking internationally.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. We represent artists from all continents. We are very, very present in the United States with New York and LA, but we are equally strong in Europe and in Asia. So yeah, it's a global view of the world.
Yeah. Lonnie, would you say that the Smithsonian and the National Museum were taking global views or more focused on the United States and American history?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I take from this conversation is that everybody who's spoken has talked about how to be transformative, right? How to make sure that we get beyond that pioneering generation to say, okay, African American artists are here too. How do we go beyond that?
Yeah.
And so part of what the challenge for me was building the African American Museum was I really felt that it had to be global, that it had to be sort of its foundation was the United States, but you couldn't tell these stories without a global context. And candidly, there was a lot of pushback.
Really?
Oh,
Like what?
absolutely. Well, first of all, there was pushback from Congress. We're going to give you money and you're going to talk about things beyond the United States. There were pushback from some of the people on the board who thought that, there's so much to tell about the African American experience. Then why are you thinking about Brazil? Why are you thinking about contextualizing slave ships and the like? And so
Right.
I think that, so there was that challenge. The other challenge, though, was to recognize that I thought that how could you not be global in this era that we're in? And I asked a fundamental question: what does national mean in a transnational age?
Yeah.
And that was really one of the major things that when we built the museum, we talked a lot about. I created a shop within that organization to do partnerships domestically and internationally. It wasn't as large as I might like, but I really wanted the museum always to be an internationally focused or an internationally conscious institution. I think the Smithsonian has always been international, but the challenge it's been ad hoc. It's my relations in South Africa or
Yeah.
some scientist
Yeah.
relations with other scientists in Vienna. And so part of what I think the challenge as secretary is to recognize that you should still have 40% of what you do should be ad hoc, right? Build those relate, but 60% ought to be strategic, ought to
Yeah.
be part of an institutional vision. So that's what I'm working on now is that international institutional vision. So we know the work we're doing, why it's important, but also we know who to dance with. There are certain partners you don't want to dance with.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the overarching strategy, all you hear is the music.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to bring maybe a sense of order to how we do things internationally. But I feel very strongly that I was a better historian when I began to do work outside the United States. It
Yeah.
taught me things about American exceptionalism. It taught me so much about who were the outsiders in South Africa versus Japan. And so, in some ways, that lesson shaped me. And I want the Smithsonian, especially the African American Museum, to be made better by the ability to dip their toes, their scholarship, their work into an international river.
So Lonnie, if I hear you correctly, and you're very clear, having or not having big money didn't make a fundamental difference in how you were building or shaping your institutions, but rather in the scale.
So here's what I would argue. I would argue that we had a vision that we knew could be shaped by the lack of resources. And so what we really did was then say, let us make sure that we don't let lack of resources limit that vision.
Okay.
Let
Yeah.
us not, it really was my time in Chicago where the motto was make no little plans. So I didn't want to have money have the plans shrunk. So part of it was that we spent a lot of time, and we were very fortunate. We haven't talked about boards, but boards are so essential to so
Yeah.
much of the fundraising. And that's why Mary's early work with a board with limited resources is really pioneering to me. I mean, it's really inspiring what you were able to do. I was lucky. I was able to pull the Ken Chenaults, the Dick Parsons, the Lyndon Johnson Rices, because I said, all right, you are people of means. Are you going to actually now do something in a way that can be transformative? Put your means to this kind of money to give us the money. And so in a way, we were able to find more money than we initially thought we needed because of the ability of people like Oprah to open doors or Dick Parsons. And so what we learned is that they could open doors, but it was still our job to go in and close the deal, to get people to understand why this was important, why it was. And candidly, the thing that got us successful fundraising was that two-sided coin I talked about, which was to say that, yes, this is about a community, but it's also about a nation. And that ability was what got some people more comfortable giving. I'll be honest with you. But my notion is, please, in my family, we were told, hey, you dance with the devil to do God's work. So that's what we tried to do.
Yeah, we have just a few minutes left, but I want to give Mary the last word here. And I want to post, building on Lonnie's comments, to you in both moments. Well, you've had many moments in your career, but your career is building the Studio Museum in Harlem. And that is to say in the 20th century, which is very different from that. And your career as president of the premier college for women of color in the United States, in which you have people of means, people like Lonnie mentioned, to support you and to build your Center for Curatorial and Art History Study. How does it feel different to be in the 20th century and to be in the 21st century?
Yeah, in many ways, the fundamental principles are the same, Nell. And people give to things that they love, that they care about, that has meaning for them. So, for example, at the Studio Museum, the fact that we had living artists, and those artists, as Marc and Lonnie know, have collectors, have people who care passionately about their work. And so they see a place that is, quote, taking care of artists, and that becomes a motivation for them to give. You spoke about international impact. I don't know of a successful artist of color who doesn't have some kind of global reference. And if that were true in the 20th century, it's even more true in the 21st century. They're exhibiting all over the world. They are influenced by the art and culture of a vast array of cultures. When I was writing the book, the biography of Romary Bearden, I had to immerse myself in all of these different art forms, because that's what informed his artwork. So that opens up new doors, new vistas for you. Here at Spelman, I arrived at a place that made international study a requirement for students. So at graduation, 75% of our students have studied abroad. So in starting a program to train art historians and curators, it had to be a program that had connections. And so here we find ourselves a partner with the Boston Institute of Contemporary Art for the Venice Biennale. And we are, preparing our students to, go to Venice when it takes place. So but this energy is what becomes the magnet for what people care about. And you have to start there. Lonnie refers to it as the vision for the Smithsonian. And similarly, we offered everyone who is funding Spelman right now a vision of what we could do for the future. Because when all is said and done, we are actually participating in the creation of the future. It's not only the past that we are resurrecting and preserving, we are giving people a way of thinking, and perhaps thinking freshly about what the future can be. And I think that's probably the most important part of what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you. Any last words, questions, comments, disagreements?
I mean, I think that, in many ways, we are in agreement. We're in agreement that there is an amazing resource that's African-American culture that deserves to be even better well known. It really is a culture that made a nation better, and that in essence, we think that this is a culture that everybody needs to embrace. And one of the things Mary's done so well is to remind us that you can't embrace that without taking care of the artists. And to make sure that the artists are taken care of, whether it's internationally or domestically, is really key. And so I thank you for letting me be part of this conversation.
Well, thank you. All right. Thank you, all three of you, so very, very much. Each of you bring a real deep view from inside what makes art and what makes culture something that masses of people can see and engage with. Because without your institutions, we couldn't see. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Nell, thank you for bringing us together. It's been great to reconnect with Lonnie and to meet Marc. This has been a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.